The morning sun cast a golden glow over the immaculate gardens of Blackwood Manor, where Eleanor Blackwood carefully tended to her mother's prized roses, her slender fingers working with practiced precision as she pruned away dead leaves and shaped the unruly branches into elegant forms. At 21, Eleanor possessed a quiet beauty that complemented the blooms around her, her chestnut hair pulled back into a simple chignon, her grey eyes reflecting intelligence and a depth of spirit that few in her social circle ever bothered to notice. She hummed softly as she worked, finding peace in the garden that eluded her within the oppressive walls of the manor house where her father, Lord Blackwood, ruled with stern authority and uncompromising expectations. The crisp spring air of 1815 carried the promise of renewal, yet for Eleanor, each passing season brought only the same routine of social obligations and the growing pressure to make an advantageous match before she became firmly established on the shelf. The roses, with their perfect symmetry and delicate fragrance, offered a momentary escape from the weight of familial duty, allowing her to imagine, if only briefly, a life where her own desires might take precedence over the carefully orchestrated future that awaited her. As Eleanor reached for a particularly stubborn stem, her maid, Jane, appeared on the garden path, her expression a mixture of apology and urgency as she approached her mistress. "Miss Eleanor, your father has been asking after you this past half hour," Jane said, casting a nervous glance toward the manor. "Lord Blackwood expects you ready for the Harrington ball tonight, miss, and the dressmaker has arrived for your final fitting." Eleanor sighed, reluctantly setting aside her gardening shears and removing her gloves, the brief respite from her responsibilities coming to its inevitable end. "Of course, Jane. Please tell father I shall be there directly," she replied, casting one last longing glance at the roses before following her maid back toward the house, her steps measured and proper, despite the rebellious thoughts that occasionally fluttered through her mind, like trapped birds seeking freedom. As they walked, Eleanor mentally prepared herself for the evening ahead, another ball where she would stand dutifully by her parents, smile politely at suitable gentlemen, and engage in the same tedious conversations about the weather and the latest London gossip, all while ignoring the hollow feeling that had taken residence in her chest these past few years, the sense that there must be more to life than this endless parade of meaningless social rituals. She ascended the stone steps to the manor entrance, her shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly as she crossed the threshold, the dutiful daughter of Lord Blackwood once again, the wistful dreamer left behind among the roses, where no one could witness such improper longings for a different sort of existence, one filled with genuine connection, intellectual stimulation, and perhaps even that most dangerous of all desires, love based on mutual respect, rather than advantageous family connections and satisfactory dowry arrangements. The Harrington ballroom glowed with the light of 1,000 candles suspended in crystal chandeliers, their brilliance reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble floors as the cream of county society twirled and preened beneath their splendor. Eleanor stood at the periphery of the dance floor, one gloved hand resting lightly on her ailing mother's chair, while her father, Lord Blackwood, surveyed the gathering with the critical eye of a general assessing troops, his tall frame rigid with the pride and authority that had shaped his daughter's existence since birth. Lady Harrington had spared no expense for her annual spring ball, from the string quartet playing Haydn from the musicians' gallery to the elaborate floral arrangements that perfumed the air with roses and lilies, their heady scent mingling with expensive perfumes and the subtle notes of anxiety that accompanied such high-stakes social events. Eleanor wore a gown of pale blue silk that her father had deemed appropriately modest, yet indicative of their family's wealth, the color washing out her complexion rather than enhancing it, a fact that escaped Lord Blackwood's notice, but added to Eleanor's sense of invisibility among the vibrant young debutantes whose laughter rang through the ballroom like silver bells. She observed them with a mixture of envy and relief, their carefree flirtations and strategic social maneuvers simultaneously attractive in their freedom and repellent in their transparency. Eleanor nodded politely as acquaintances greeted her family, answering questions about her mother's health with practiced responses while silently noting how quickly attention shifted away from her to more engaging conversational partners. A sudden hush fell over one section of the ballroom, the ripple of whispers spreading across the gathering like wind through summer wheat until it reached Eleanor and her parents. The Duke of Westmoreland has returned from abroad. Eleanor heard Lady Pembroke inform her mother with poorly disguised excitement. Alexander Hayes himself, after 3 years on the continent. They say he has changed dramatically since his father's death. Lord Blackwood stiffened almost imperceptibly at the name, his fingers tightening around his walking stick as he turned toward the ballroom entrance. Eleanor followed his gaze, curious about the man whose mere mention could disturb her father's composure, and found herself unable to look away from the commanding figure who had just entered the room. The Duke stood taller than most men present, his broad shoulders and confident stance drawing every eye in the gathering. His features were striking rather than conventionally handsome, with intense dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, a strong jaw shadowed by what appeared to be the continental fashion of slightly longer sideburns, and an expression of amused detachment that suggested he found the social rituals around him somewhat absurd. Unlike the other gentlemen in their perfectly tailored black evening attire, the Duke wore a midnight blue coat that hinted at his time abroad, the subtle difference marking him as someone who followed his own inclinations rather than society's rigid expectations. As he greeted Lady Harrington with a bow that managed to be both proper and somehow ironic, Eleanor felt a curious sensation in her chest, as if something long dormant had suddenly stirred to life. Her father's voice cut through her thoughts, unusually sharp as he addressed her mother. "We shall not remain late this evening," he stated flatly. "Lady Blackwood requires her rest." Eleanor heard the unspoken command beneath his words and understood with sudden clarity that the Duke of Westmoreland represented something forbidden, though she could not imagine why. She cast one more glance in his direction, only to find those penetrating dark eyes meeting hers across the crowded room, a brief moment of connection that sent an unexpected thrill through her veins before she obediently lowered her gaze, unaware that this glimpse of Alexander Hayes would mark the beginning of a transformation in her carefully ordered world. The persistent melody of the string quartet and the constant hum of conversation had begun to press upon Eleanor like a physical weight, the endless social niceties and watchful gaze of her father draining her limited reserves of patience and composure. With her mother engaged in conversation with an old acquaintance and Lord Blackwood momentarily occupied discussing politics with a fellow landowner, Eleanor seized her opportunity for escape, slipping away from the ballroom with practiced discretion, her steps quickening as she moved down the corridor in search of sanctuary. The Harrington Library beckoned like a promise of peace, its heavy oak door standing slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling onto the hallway carpet. Eleanor entered gratefully, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to instantly muffle the clamor of the ball, replacing it with blessed quiet, broken only by the gentle crackling of a fire in the hearth. The room smelled of leather bindings, beeswax polish, and wood smoke, a combination Eleanor found infinitely more appealing than the competing perfumes of the ballroom. Shelves of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of rich colors and gold lettering that glowed in the firelight. A pair of comfortable reading chairs had been positioned near the hearth, and several lamps cast pools of amber light across the space, creating an atmosphere of intimate seclusion. Eleanor moved deeper into the room, running her fingertips along the spines of the books, reading titles and authors with genuine interest, so absorbed in her exploration that she failed to notice she was not alone until a voice spoke from the shadows near the window. "I find Gibbon rather pessimistic in his assessment of human progress, though his prose is undeniably magnificent." Eleanor gasped, spinning toward the voice, her hand flying to her throat in surprise as she made out the tall figure of the Duke of Westmoreland emerging from the dimness into the firelight, a leather-bound volume in his hands. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion," she managed, mortified to be caught wandering unaccompanied in a private room. "I did not realize anyone was here." The Duke closed his book, his expression more curious than censorious as he regarded her. "No apology necessary, Miss Blackwood. The library was precisely where I sought refuge as well." He gestured toward the shelves, The true character of a household is often revealed in its library rather than its ballroom. Would you not agree? Eleanor hesitated, surprised by both his recognition of her identity and his unexpected conversational gambit. Indeed, Your Grace, though I suspect most would consider such a preference rather unfashionable, she ventured, watching his reaction carefully. The Duke smiled, transforming his austere features into something genuinely warm. Fashion has never been my primary concern, Miss Blackwood, particularly when it conflicts with substance. He indicated the second reading chair near the fire. Perhaps you might share your literary opinions, as I have been too long abroad to know what English society currently deems acceptable reading for young ladies. Is it still restricted to improving sermons and insipid poetry about flowers? The gentle mockery in his tone invited complicity rather than offense, and Eleanor found herself moving toward the offered chair, her initial embarrassment giving way to unexpected ease in his presence. I fear you would find my reading habits quite scandalous then, Your Grace, she replied with newfound boldness, for I prefer history and philosophy to sermons, and have even ventured into political treatises when my father is not monitoring my selections. As they settled before the fire, the conversation flowed with surprising naturalness, touching on everything from the latest translations of Greek classics to the political situation in Europe following Napoleon's defeat. The Duke listened to her opinions with genuine attention, challenging her perspectives without condescension and offering insights from his travels that expanded her understanding of the world beyond England's shores. Eleanor found herself speaking with an animation and honesty she rarely displayed, the artificial constraints of proper social interaction falling away in the face of true intellectual engagement. When the library clock chimed the hour, Eleanor realized with a start that they had been conversing for nearly 40 minutes, time that had passed like mere moments, leaving her with the curious sensation of having met a kindred spirit in the most unexpected of places. I should return to my parents, she said reluctantly, rising from her chair. The Duke rose as well, his height more apparent as he stood before her, yet somehow not intimidating. May I hope for another such conversation, Miss Blackwood? He asked, his dark eyes intent on her face. Eleanor felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, a recognition that extended beyond their shared intellectual interests to something more elemental and profound. I would like that very much, Your Grace, she answered honestly, unaware that this quiet exchange in a firelit library had set in motion events that would soon challenge everything she had ever known about duty, family, and her own capacity for courage. The Blackwood family carriage creaked and swayed along the moonlit country roads, its interior cloaked in shadows broken only by the occasional flicker of passing lanterns that briefly illuminated the occupants within. Lord Blackwood sat rigidly opposite his wife and daughter, his hawk-like features set in lines of barely concealed displeasure as he observed Eleanor through narrowed eyes. Lady Blackwood reclined against the cushioned seat, her breathing shallow and her complexion alarmingly pale even in the dim light, the evening's exertions having clearly taxed her fragile constitution beyond prudence. The atmosphere inside the confined space grew increasingly oppressive as the miles passed, charged with unspoken accusations and simmering tension that made the journey seem interminable, despite the swift pace of their matched bay horses. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the passing landscape visible through the carriage window, though in truth she saw little of the shadowed trees and hedgerows, her mind still lingering in the Harrington Library, and on the unexpected connection she had formed with the Duke of Westmoreland. A small, secret smile threatened to curve her lips as she recalled their conversation, but she suppressed it quickly, aware of her father's scrutiny and the dangerous territory of her own thoughts. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut, until Lord Blackwood finally broke it with a question that sliced through the darkness with precision. You were absent from the ballroom for quite some time this evening, Eleanor. His voice was deceptively calm, a tone she recognized as more dangerous than his open anger. Who were you speaking with in the library? You were gone nearly an hour. Eleanor felt her heart quicken but kept her expression carefully neutral as she turned from the window to meet her father's gaze. I merely needed a moment of quiet, Father. The library offered respite from the noise. Lord Blackwood leaned forward slightly, the leather of the seat creaking beneath his weight. You did not answer my question. With whom were you conversing? The footman noticed you did not emerge alone. Eleanor hesitated, weighing her options in the space of a breath. To lie would be discovered immediately, as her father clearly already knew the answer, yet to admit the truth would provoke a reaction she instinctively wished to avoid. The Duke of Westmoreland happened to be in the library as well, father. We discussed literature briefly. Her voice remained steady despite the sudden tension that radiated from her father at the mention of the Duke. Lady Blackwood stirred at this exchange, her weary eyes moving between husband and daughter with growing concern. Literature, Lord Blackwood repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. And what would a man like Alexander Hayes know of literature, beyond what might serve his own corrupt purposes? Eleanor felt a flare of indignation rise within her chest, surprising in its intensity. Actually, he is quite well read and has interesting perspectives from his time abroad. I found our conversation most enlightening. The moment the words left her mouth, Eleanor recognized her tactical error. Lord Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle working beneath the skin as he regarded his daughter with cold fury. "You will not speak to that man again," he declared, each word delivered with the weight of immutable law. "The Hayes family has been the enemy of the Blackwoods for generations. They are not to be trusted, particularly that young libertine who now styles himself a duke." Lady Blackwood reached weakly for her husband's hand. "Perhaps we might discuss this tomorrow, my dear, when we are all less fatigued." The subtle intercession only seemed to harden Lord Blackwood's resolve. "There is nothing to discuss," he replied flatly. "Eleanor will obey my instructions in this matter, as in all others." He turned his gaze back to his daughter, his expression brooking no defiance. "Do I make myself clear?" Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly proper, before lowering her eyes in apparent submission. "Yes, father," she responded quietly, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. As the carriage continued its journey through the darkness toward Blackwood Manor, Eleanor kept her face turned toward the window once more, concealing the unexpected spark of rebellion that had ignited within her, a small flame of defiance that the evening's encounter had somehow kindled against all her years of dutiful compliance. 3 days after the Harrington ball, the sombre tranquility of Blackwood Manor was disrupted by the unexpected arrival of a distinguished carriage bearing the Westmoreland crest upon its polished door. The sound of wheels on gravel, drawing the attention of the household and sending a flurry of activity through the servants' quarters. Eleanor had been practicing at the pianoforte in the morning room when Simmons, the family butler, appeared at the doorway with an expression of barely concealed discomfort, announcing in measured tones that His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland, requested the honor of paying his respects to the family. The news sent a jolt of surprised pleasure through Eleanor, followed immediately by apprehension as she recalled her father's explicit prohibition regarding any contact with Alexander Hayes. Lord Blackwood, who had been reviewing estate accounts in his study, emerged with thunderous brows when informed of their visitor, instructing Simmons to show the Duke into the formal drawing room with a coldness that bordered on impropriety given their guest's rank. Eleanor followed her father into the drawing room, her heart beating an irregular rhythm against her ribs as she struggled to maintain an outward appearance of calm. The Duke stood by the window, sunlight illuminating his tall figure as he turned to greet them, his formal morning attire, impeccable yet somehow less rigid than most gentlemen of his station, suggesting a man comfortable enough in his position to bend conventions to his preference. "Lord Blackwood, Miss Blackwood." He acknowledged them with a precise bow, his dark eyes lingering on Eleanor with warmth that sent color rising to her cheeks despite her best efforts at composure. "I was riding in the vicinity and thought to pay my respects to your family." Lord Blackwood offered the barest minimum of civil greeting, his posture rigid with hostility barely contained beneath the veneer of social obligation. "Lady Blackwood is indisposed this morning, Your Grace. We are honored by your attention, but would not wish to delay your ride." The Duke appeared entirely unperturbed by this transparent attempt at dismissal. "Actually, I had hoped Miss Blackwood might show me your famous rose gardens. I understand they rival any in the county." Eleanor glanced quickly at her father, whose jaw had tightened visibly at the request, before responding with careful politeness. "Our gardens are indeed at their best this time of year, Your Grace. I would be happy to show you their modest attractions." Lord Blackwood cleared his throat with evident displeasure. "Eleanor has correspondence to attend to this morning, I fear, but perhaps another time." "No, Father. I have completed my letters," Eleanor contradicted him with unprecedented boldness. "It would be my pleasure to accompany His Grace." Before Lord Blackwood could formulate another objection, the Duke smiled with perfect courtesy. "Excellent. I promise to return Miss Blackwood within the half-hour, so as not to disrupt your family's schedule." The formality of the drawing-room gave way to the vibrant beauty of the gardens, as Eleanor led the Duke along gravel paths bordered by spring blooms, acutely aware of both his commanding presence beside her and her father's undoubtedly watching from his study window. The rose garden spread before them in carefully tended beds, the early varieties already offering delicate pink and white blossoms that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. "Your father seems less than pleased by my visit," the Duke observed with frank amusement as they strolled between the flower beds. Eleanor hesitated, torn between honesty and discretion. "There is some historical discord between our families that concerns him," she admitted finally, looking up at her companion with curious eyes. "Though I confess I know little of its nature." The Duke nodded thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing of his own knowledge on the matter. "Perhaps some histories are best left unexplored, at least temporarily." He gestured toward a particularly fine white rose. "Your skill with these blooms suggests a patient and nurturing nature, Miss Blackwood." Their conversation shifted to safer topics, the latest books from London, the Duke's recent travels through Italy, and Eleanor's own carefully expressed desire to see something of the world beyond Hampshire County. "I have always dreamed of visiting Florence," she confided as they rounded a bend in the path partially concealed from the house by a tall hedge. "The art, the architecture, the sense of history so different from our own." The Duke regarded her with a penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond her proper exterior to the yearning spirit within. "Italy changes one's perspective irrevocably," he said softly. "The light there transforms everything it touches, revealing beauty in places one might never have thought to look for it." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance, creating a connection that Eleanor felt resonate through her very being, a recognition of kindred minds, despite all the social and familial barriers that stood between them. As they reluctantly turned back toward the house where Lord Blackwood undoubtedly awaited with growing impatience, Eleanor realized with startling clarity that the Duke of Westmoreland represented not merely an intriguing acquaintance or forbidden friendship, but a dangerous temptation toward a life she had never dared to imagine for herself, one where her own desires might matter more than the rigid expectations that had always defined her existence. The moment the Duke's carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Eleanor felt the temporary freedom of his presence evaporate, like morning mist beneath a harsh Sunday. Simmons appeared at her side before she had even reached the entrance hall, his expression grave as he delivered the summons she had been dreading. "Lord Blackwood requests your immediate attendance in his study, Miss Eleanor." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of judgment, leaving Eleanor no choice but to follow the butler through the familiar corridors of her childhood home, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation that awaited. The study door stood ajar, revealing a slice of the room beyond, a space Eleanor had always associated with paternal authority and, occasionally, punishment. She entered with her chin lifted slightly higher than proper deference might dictate, finding her father standing before the massive stone fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece beneath the mounted head of a stag he had shot in his younger days. The room smelled of leather-bound books, tobacco, and beeswax polish, the dark oak paneling absorbing what little sunlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight regardless of the hour. Hunting trophies adorned the walls, glass eyes of various beasts staring down at Eleanor as she moved to stand before her father's desk, their lifeless gazes somehow adding to the sense of judgment that permeated the chamber. Lord Blackwood did not immediately acknowledge her presence, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably as he continued to stare into the cold grate of the fireplace, a tactical delay Eleanor recognized as a means of establishing dominance in the conversation to follow. When he finally turned to face her, his expression revealed the cold, controlled rage she had witnessed only a handful of times in her life, occasions that had invariably resulted in irrevocable decisions and unyielding pronouncements. "I believed I had made myself perfectly clear regarding Alexander Hayes," he began, his voice deceptively quiet. "Yet today I find you not only speaking with him but walking unescorted through the gardens, visible to any passing neighbor or servant, creating gossip that will undoubtedly reach every household in the county by nightfall." Eleanor clasped her hands before her to prevent their trembling, though whether from fear or indignation she could not entirely determine. "I was hardly unescorted, father. We remained within sight of the house at all times, and Jane followed at a discreet distance." Lord Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do not attempt to justify your disobedience with technicalities." He moved away from the fireplace to stand directly before her, using his considerable height to further intimidate. "The Duke's family and ours have been enemies for generations. His father ruined mine at court. I forbid you to see him again." The vehemence in his voice startled even Eleanor, who had expected disapproval but not this level of intensity. "His father ruined yours?" she asked, momentarily forgetting her proper place in her curiosity about this revelation. "How so?" Lord Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly at her questioning. "The particulars are not your concern. Suffice it to say that the old Duke of Westmoreland used his influence with the Prince Regent to undermine my father's position, costing him a diplomatic appointment that should have been his by right and merit." A slight frown creased Eleanor's brow as she processed this information, which seemed at odds with the character of the man she had just walked with through the rose garden. "Surely the son should not be judged by the actions of his father," she ventured cautiously. "The Duke himself has shown nothing but courtesy and proper respect toward our family." Lord Blackwood slammed his palm against the surface of his desk with such sudden violence that Eleanor flinched involuntarily. "Alexander Hayes is cut from the same deceitful cloth as his sire," he declared, his composure slipping to reveal the depth of his antipathy. "He courts your acquaintance now as a means of revenge, nothing more. I will not stand by while a Blackwood is used as a pawn in his game against our family." A spark of defiance that Eleanor had not known she possessed flickered to life within her breast. "The Duke does not strike me as a man who would engage in such petty machinations," she countered, her voice steadier than she felt. "His conversation reveals an educated mind and honorable principles." Lord Blackwood regarded his daughter with growing incredulity, as if seeing her for the first time. "You presume to judge his character based on a few pretty phrases in a garden?" he asked, contempt evident in every syllable. "Your naivety would be amusing were it not so dangerous." He circled back behind his desk, assuming the position from which he had delivered countless dictates throughout Eleanor's life. "Hear me well, daughter. You will not receive Alexander Hayes should he call again. You will not correspond with him under any circumstances. You will not even speak his name within this house. Any violation of these instructions will result in consequences you cannot begin to imagine." The threat hung in the air between them, all the more effective for its lack of specificity, leaving Eleanor's imagination to supply the potential punishments for continued defiance. "Yes, father," she responded after a moment, her tone carefully modulated to convey acquiescence while concealing the confusion of emotions that churned beneath her composed exterior, a tempest of resentment, fear, and most disturbing of all, a strange exhilaration at the thought of the man she had been so absolutely forbidden to see again. A fortnight passed in which Eleanor observed the strictest compliance with her father's edict, attending to her usual duties with apparent docility, while an inner rebellion smouldered beneath her carefully maintained facade of obedience. The Duke called twice more at Blackwood Manor, only to be turned away with increasingly discourteous excuses, his name never mentioned in Eleanor's presence, though she felt each rejection like a physical pain, despite having no official knowledge of his visits. It was Jane who first suggested the possibility of clandestine communication, approaching Eleanor cautiously one evening as she prepared her mistress for bed, the loyal maid's expression both conspiratorial and concerned, as she withdrew a sealed letter from her apron pocket. "The Duke of Westmoreland asked me to deliver this to you directly, miss," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the closed bedroom door. He was most insistent and offered assurances that no harm would come to me for my service. Eleanor stared at the folded paper with its elegant handwriting and unbroken seal, her heart pounding as she contemplated the magnitude of the defiance contained in that simple act of accepting the missive. After a momentary hesitation that encompassed all her years of dutiful adherence to her father's will, she reached for the letter with trembling fingers, the weight of it in her palm seeming far greater than mere paper and ink warranted. "Thank you, Jane," she murmured, her voice scarcely audible even in the quiet bedroom. "Your loyalty will not be forgotten." That night, when the household had fallen silent and only the occasional creak of settling timbers disturbed the darkness, Eleanor lit a single candle beside her bed and broke the seal on the Duke's letter, her eyes eagerly devouring his bold, decisive handwriting, as he expressed his regret at being denied the pleasure of her company and his determination to maintain their acquaintance, despite Lord Blackwood's evident disapproval. The words stirred something profound within her, a recognition that someone beyond her family circle valued her thoughts and presence sufficiently to risk social impropriety in pursuit of continued connection. Eleanor responded before dawn, penning a careful reply that maintained propriety while conveying her own disappointment at their forced separation, entrusting the sealed letter to Jane with mingled excitement and trepidation. Thus began a correspondence that flourished in secrecy over subsequent weeks, each letter exchanged representing another small act of independence for Eleanor, and another brick removed from the wall of isolation her father had constructed around her life. The Duke wrote of his travels, describing the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany and the ancient splendors of Rome with such vivid detail that Eleanor could almost feel the Mediterranean warmth on her skin as she read his words by candlelight, her imagination freed from the confines of Hampshire through the power of his descriptions. She responded with increasing openness, sharing her thoughts on books they had both read, her observations of the subtle changes in the gardens as spring matured towards summer, and eventually her private hopes for experiences beyond the limited horizons that had always bounded her existence. Their exchanges grew gradually more personal, traversing the careful distance of formal acquaintances towards something that Eleanor hesitated to name even in the privacy of her thoughts, though her anticipation of each new letter and the warmth that suffused her at the sight of his handwriting suggested emotions she had previously encountered only in the pages of novels. The revelation came in his 7th letter, delivered after a particularly unpleasant evening during which Lord Blackwood had extolled the virtues of a neighbouring landowner's son as a potential match for Eleanor, her father's transparent matchmaking causing a heaviness in her heart that only the arrival of the Duke's missive could dispel. "I feel I must address the enmity between our families directly," Alexander wrote, "for I cannot in good conscience continue our correspondence without revealing what I know of its origins. The breach between our fathers was indeed caused by a ruined appointment, but the truth stands opposite to what you have likely been told. It was your father who penned anonymous letters to the Prince Regent, falsely accusing mine of Jacobin sympathies during a time when such associations meant political death. My father discovered the deception only after the appointment was lost, finding evidence of Lord Blackwood's hand in the matter, but choosing not to expose him publicly for fear of destroying 2 families rather than only his own." Eleanor read these words with growing horror, the foundations of her understanding shaken by this alternative history that cast her father as villain rather than victim, yet explained his vehemence in ways his own account had not. The Duke continued with gentle consideration, emphasizing that he shared this truth not to drive a wedge between Eleanor and her father, but to establish honesty between them, a principle he valued above all others in human relations. "I tell you this not to secure your allegiance in ancient grievances," he wrote near the conclusion, "but because I find myself caring for your good opinion in ways that surprise and somewhat alarm me, making falsehood between us intolerable regardless of its comfortable convenience." Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest when she finished reading, her mind awhirl with conflicting loyalties and unsettling revelations. Yet beneath the confusion burned a growing certainty that the connection forming between herself and Alexander Hayes represented something worth the risk of her father's displeasure, perhaps even something worth fighting for should such a battle become necessary. 3 days after receiving the Duke's revelation about her father's deception, Eleanor found herself drawn inexorably toward the abandoned eastern section of the Blackwood Gardens, an area left largely to nature's devices since her grandmother's passing a decade earlier. The path she followed was partially overgrown, stone pavers nearly obscured by encroaching moss and wild grasses that brushed against her skirts as she moved cautiously through the untamed greenery, glancing occasionally over her shoulder to ensure she remained unobserved by the household. Jane had delivered the message at breakfast, slipped beneath her napkin with practiced discretion, the brief note containing only a time and the mention of the old gazebo, a structure Eleanor had not visited in years, but recalled from childhood explorations as a hidden sanctuary among tangled roses and wisteria vines. The knowledge that Alexander would be waiting there sent anticipation coursing through her veins, mingled with the sharp edge of anxiety that accompanied this most flagrant defiance of her father's explicit prohibition. The gazebo appeared before her like something from a fairy tale, its weathered wooden frame almost completely concealed by a riot of climbing plants, wild roses in delicate pink and white, blooming among glossy ivy that had claimed the structure as its own over years of neglect. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy of an ancient oak that stood sentinel beside the pavilion, casting shifting patterns across the worn floorboards as Eleanor approached with quickened steps, her heart thundering against her ribs with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. She found him standing with his back to the entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the greenery beyond, shoulders bearing the unmistakable tension of a man aware that his actions crossed boundaries of proper conduct. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression transforming from anxious anticipation to undisguised joy as their eyes met across the weathered threshold. "Eleanor," he breathed, the single word carrying a wealth of emotion that caused her breath to catch in her throat. "Alexander," she responded simply, stepping fully into the gazebo, her usual formality forgotten in the intimacy of their clandestine meeting place. The space between them seemed charged with unspoken feeling, drawing them together until they stood mere inches apart, close enough that Eleanor could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that she had come to associate with his correspondence, an association now made flesh in his immediate presence. "I received your letter," she said softly, her eyes searching his for confirmation of the troubling history he had related. "Is it truly as you wrote?" The Duke nodded gravely, regret evident in the set of his features. "Every word, though I take no pleasure in being the bearer of such disillusionment. I debated whether to share that knowledge at all, but could not bear the thought of deception between us, however well-intentioned." His honesty only deepened Eleanor's conflicted emotions, the foundation of her understanding of her father cracking further with each moment in Alexander's presence. "I believe you," she admitted, the admission itself a kind of betrayal of family loyalty yet somehow necessary for her own integrity. The revelation explains much about father's behavior that never quite made sense before. The relief in Alexander's eyes at her acceptance of his account was palpable, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his expression remained serious. "I would not have you think I sought you out initially because of the history between our families, Eleanor. Our first meeting in the Harrington Library was genuine happenstance, though I confess I recognized your name when Lady Pembroke mentioned it later that evening." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the implication that he had discussed her with others, had sought information about her beyond their chance encounter. "Yet it did not stop you from pursuing further acquaintance," she observed, not quite a question but an invitation for explanation. Alexander's gaze intensified, seeming to look beyond her composed exterior to the woman beneath the careful social facade. "I told myself it was mere curiosity at first," he admitted. "Then intellectual compatibility after our conversation." His hand moved as if to reach for hers before he checked the impulse, propriety reasserting itself even in their private sanctuary. "But I've come to recognize that my feelings have progressed far beyond either justification. I know I shouldn't pursue you against your father's wishes, but I cannot help what my heart desires." The naked honesty of his declaration hung in the air between them, stripping away the polite fictions and social niceties that had governed their previous interactions, even in their most candid correspondence. Eleanor felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, the solid ground of her carefully ordered existence falling away to reveal uncharted territory, both terrifying and exhilarating in its possibilities. "My father would never consent," she whispered, the practical reality of their situation reasserting itself, despite the emotional current drawing her toward this man who had awakened longings she had scarcely acknowledged even to herself. Alexander stepped closer, propriety momentarily forgotten, as he gently took her gloved hand in his, the contact sending a thrill of awareness through her body, despite the layers of fabric separating skin from skin. "Would you have me walk away then?" he asked, his voice low and fervent in the secluded space. "Tell me to leave Hampshire, to trouble you no more with my presence, and I shall do so, though it would pain me more than I can express." Eleanor looked up into his eyes, so intent upon her face, and felt something within her shift irrevocably, a surrender not to him but to her own heart's inclination, terrifying in its clarity and simplicity. "No," she whispered, barely audible even in the hushed atmosphere of their sanctuary. "I would not have you go." The admission cost her dearly, representing as it did a conscious choice to defy the paternal authority that had governed her entire existence. Yet she could not bring herself to regret it as Alexander's expression transformed with hope and tenderness, his fingers tightening gently around hers in silent acknowledgement of the significance of her words and all they might come to mean for them both. The week following Eleanor's clandestine meeting with Alexander in the gazebo passed in a strange juxtaposition of mundane routine and secret exhilaration, each ordinary task performed with the heightened awareness of one carrying a momentous secret. She attended to her mother's needs, practiced her pianoforte, and engaged in all the expected activities of a gentleman's daughter, while her thoughts constantly returned to the Duke's declaration and her own unprecedented admission of feeling. Their correspondence continued through Jane's loyal intermediacy, each letter exchanged like a small act of rebellion that strengthened Eleanor's resolve, even as it increased the danger of discovery. The inevitable exposure arrived on a Thursday evening, as the family gathered in the dining room for their evening meal, the familiar setting providing no warning of the calamity about to unfold. Lord Blackwood sat at the head of the mahogany table as always, with Lady Blackwood opposite him and Eleanor positioned between them, the polished silver and fine china, arranged with precision that reflected the ordered existence her father demanded. The room itself spoke of generational wealth and tradition, with its damask wallpaper, ancestral portraits, and heavy velvet draperies drawn against the early evening light, creating an atmosphere of contained formality that Eleanor had never before questioned. The footman had just served the fish course when Lord Blackwood reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a folded paper that Eleanor recognized with immediate sickening clarity as Alexander's most recent letter, the seal broken and the intimate contents apparently exposed to her father's scrutiny. He placed the letter beside his plate with deliberate care, his movements controlled despite the cold fury evident in his expression as he regarded his daughter across the perfectly arranged table settings. "Perhaps you might explain this, Eleanor," he said, his voice deceptively calm as he indicated the damning evidence with one finger. "I discovered it among your belongings when I had Simmons search your room this afternoon." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her light-headed with shock and dismay, even as indignation flared at this invasion of her privacy. Her mother gasped softly, setting down her fork with a trembling hand as she glanced between husband and daughter with growing alarm. "You had my room searched?" Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper, buying precious seconds to gather her composure before the inevitable confrontation. "After receiving information that you had been seen in the old garden area, where coincidentally the Duke of Westmoreland was observed leaving our property," Lord Blackwood replied, each word precise and cutting. "I considered it my paternal duty to ascertain the extent of your disobedience. Based on the contents of this and several other letters I located, that extent appears considerable." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, drawing on previously untapped reserves of courage as she faced her father's wrath. "Those letters are private, father," she said, her voice steadier than she would have thought possible. Lord Blackwood's controlled demeanor shattered at her response, his fist slamming against the table with such force that the crystal goblets jumped and rang in protest. "Private?" he thundered, causing the attending footman to flinch and Lady Blackwood to press trembling fingers to her lips. "Nothing in this house is private from me, least of all the disgraceful correspondence between my daughter and the son of my greatest enemy." His face had flushed dark with rage, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple as he rose to his feet, looming over the table in a physical manifestation of his patriarchal authority. "Eleanor, what have you done?" Lady Blackwood whispered, her voice faint with distress. "For years I have tolerated your books and your opinions," Lord Blackwood continued, his voice rising with each word. "I have indulged your education beyond what any daughter requires, permitted you freedoms most fathers would consider excessive, and this is how you repay my leniency, by betraying your family for a man who seeks only to use you as an instrument of revenge?" Eleanor felt a curious calm descend as the confrontation she had feared for weeks finally materialized, bringing with it an unexpected clarity about her own desires and convictions. "Alexander Hayes is an honorable man, Father," she stated firmly. "He has been nothing but forthright about the history between our families, including your role in his father's disgrace." Lord Blackwood recoiled as if struck, his complexion shifting from angry red to ashen in the space of a heartbeat. "He has poisoned your mind against your own blood," he snarled, any pretense of rationality abandoned as he advanced around the table toward Eleanor, who instinctively rose to her feet, rather than remain seated beneath his threatening approach. "You foolish, ungrateful child. Can you not see that he courts you only to wound me through you?" His fingers closed around her upper arm with bruising force as he towered over her, his face contorted with a fury she had never before witnessed. "I forbid you to love him. He seeks only to destroy our family through you." Eleanor winced at his painful grip, but did not cower, something within her refusing to bend before this storm of paternal rage. As Lord Blackwood continued his tirade, neither father nor daughter noticed the dining room door opening quietly behind them, nor the tall figure who stepped silently into the room, drawn by the sounds of disturbance heard from the entrance hall, where he had arrived moments earlier. It was only when Lady Blackwood gasped, her wide eyes fixed on a point beyond her husband's shoulder, that Lord Blackwood broke off mid-sentence and whirled to confront the unexpected witness to this family discord. Alexander stood framed in the doorway, his expression a complex mixture of concern for Eleanor and cold assessment of Lord Blackwood, whose hand still gripped his daughter's arm with inappropriate force. "I apologize for the intrusion," the Duke said, his voice level despite the charged atmosphere he had entered. The butler appeared to be otherwise engaged, and I could not help overhearing what sounded like distress. "Perhaps I might request a private word with you, Lord Blackwood." The silence that followed this calm intervention vibrated with tension as Eleanor found herself caught between terror at the unexpected confrontation and a wild surge of hope at Alexander's perfectly timed appearance, his steady presence offering a counterpoint to her father's uncontrolled fury and a promise of possible deliverance from the suffocating confines of Blackwood Manor. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke as darkness fell across the Hampshire countryside, rain lashing against the windows of Blackwood Manor with biblical intensity, turning the well-kept grounds into shadowed pools and racing rivulets that gleamed silver in the occasional flash of distant lightning. Alexander Hayes, Duke of Westmoreland, had ridden through the worsening weather with single-minded determination, his decision to call upon Lord Blackwood directly having crystallized after days of introspection, and Eleanor's most recent letter, which had conveyed her increasing distress at the untenable situation between them. The Duke had arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the deluge reached its peak, dismounting from his rain-lashed horse and handing the reins to a startled stable boy before striding toward the main entrance, his greatcoat sodden and his boots leaving muddy imprints on the gravel path. The elderly butler had answered his insistent knock with poorly concealed surprise, clearly unprepared for visitors on such an inclement evening, and particularly not one of such high rank appearing unannounced and unaccompanied. "Your Grace," Simmons stammered, his usual composure momentarily forgotten as he took in the Duke's rain-soaked appearance. "We were not expecting, that is, Lord Blackwood is currently at dinner with the family." "I must announce you." Alexander removed his dripping hat, water cascading onto the marble floor of the entrance hall as he stepped inside without awaiting a formal invitation. "Please do so," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument despite its perfect civility. "I regret the unseasonable hour of my call, but I have matters of importance to discuss with Lord Blackwood that cannot wait upon fair weather or social convenience." The butler hesitated, visibly torn between protocol and the authority inherent in the Duke's bearing and title, but before he could respond, the unmistakable sounds of raised voices penetrated the entrance hall from deeper within the house, the words indistinct but the tone of fury unmistakable. Alexander's expression hardened as he recognized Lord Blackwood's distinctive baritone pitched to levels that suggested something far beyond proper gentlemanly discourse. Without waiting for the butler's guidance, he moved swiftly toward the source of the disturbance, droplets of rainwater marking his path across the polished floor as he followed the corridor toward what appeared to be the dining room. The heavy oak door stood partially ajar, allowing Lord Blackwood's next words to reach the Duke with perfect clarity as he approached the threshold. "I forbid you to love him. He seeks only to destroy our family through you." Alexander froze momentarily, the raw emotion in those words confirming his worst fears about Eleanor's treatment at her father's hands and galvanizing his resolve beyond any remaining doubt or hesitation. He pushed the door open fully, taking in the scene before him with a single comprehensive glance, his soldier's instinct for assessment serving him well in this moment of crisis. Eleanor stood rigid beside the dining table, her face pale, but her posture unbowed, despite Lord Blackwood's towering presence and the painful grip he maintained on her arm. Lady Blackwood remained seated, her frail form seeming to shrink further into her chair as the confrontation unfolded, while a young footman pressed himself against the wall as if wishing to become invisible in the face of his master's rage. "I apologize for the intrusion," Alexander stated calmly, though the careful observer might have noticed the muscle working in his jaw and the dangerous glint in his eyes as he observed Lord Blackwood's hold on Eleanor. The butler appeared to be otherwise engaged, and I could not help overhearing what sounded like distress. "Perhaps I might request a private word with you, Lord Blackwood." Lord Blackwood released Eleanor's arm as if suddenly burned by the contact, turning to face the unexpected intruder with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to outrage. "Hayes!" he snarled, the name itself an accusation as he advanced toward the doorway. "You dare enter my home uninvited? This is beyond even your family's notorious disregard for propriety." Alexander remained perfectly still, water still dripping from his coat to form a small puddle at his feet, the physical evidence of his journey through the storm lending dramatic emphasis to his appearance. "I believe there are matters between us that require immediate resolution," he replied, his voice controlled yet resonant with authority, particularly in light of what I have just witnessed and overheard. His gaze shifted momentarily to Eleanor, conveying without words his concern for her well-being and his commitment to the feelings they had acknowledged in the gazebo and their subsequent correspondence. The meaning of that glance was not lost on Lord Blackwood, whose face darkened further with comprehension of the depth of connection between his daughter and the son of his enemy. "Get out," he commanded, pointing toward the entrance hall with a trembling finger. "Whatever grievances exist between our families, they will not be addressed in my dining room while you drip rainwater on my floors." Alexander's expression remained impassive in the face of this dismissal, his focus shifting back to Lord Blackwood with calm deliberation. "I will leave when I have said what I came to say," he stated with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And I believe Miss Blackwood should remain present, as her future happiness is central to the matter at hand." The audacity of this statement hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to Lord Blackwood's patriarchal authority within his own household that rendered him momentarily speechless with indignation. In the silence that followed, Eleanor moved slowly away from the dining table to stand midway between her father and Alexander, her position a physical manifestation of her divided loyalties and the choice that now confronted her. The rain continued to beat against the windows with relentless intensity, nature's percussion providing dramatic accompaniment to the human drama unfolding within the dining room as three lives balanced on the precipice of irrevocable change. The Duke's unexpected arrival, transforming a family quarrel into a moment of profound significance that would alter all their futures in ways none could fully anticipate. The dining room of Blackwood Manor had transformed from a space of genteel family ritual to a battleground of wills, with Lord Blackwood, Alexander, and Eleanor forming a triangle of tension at its centre. Lady Blackwood remained at the table, her dinner forgotten, her trembling hands clutching a handkerchief as she watched the scene unfold with wide, fearful eyes. Behind them, servants hovered uncertainly at the service door, torn between protocol that demanded their invisible presence during the meal and the impropriety of witnessing such an unprecedented confrontation between gentlemen. The crystal chandelier cast harsh light upon the tableau, reflecting in the polished silver and fine china, now abandoned in favor of this unexpected drama. Alexander stood with military straightness despite his sodden appearance, rainwater still dripping occasionally from his greatcoat to form a small puddle on the Aubusson carpet, the physical evidence of his determination to reach Blackwood Manor, regardless of conditions or consequences. "You will say nothing in my house that concerns my daughter," Lord Blackwood declared, finding his voice at last, his complexion mottled with suppressed fury. "She is under my authority until I choose to bestow her hand upon a worthy gentleman, a category that will never include the son of Jeremiah Hayes." Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging Lord Blackwood's words without conceding to their substance. "I understand your position perfectly, sir," he replied, his calm demeanour providing stark contrast to the older man's barely contained rage. "And having heard your concerns, expressed with such vehemence to your daughter moments ago, I am all the more determined to make Eleanor my Duchess. I ask for her hand immediately and formally." The audacity of this declaration in the face of Lord Blackwood's explicit prohibition rendered the room utterly silent for several heartbeats. The only sound, the persistent drumming of rain against the windows, and the almost imperceptible gasp that escaped Eleanor at the Duke's words. She stood transfixed between the two men, her eyes wide with mingled shock and dawning hope as she absorbed the implications of Alexander's proposal, delivered not in some romantic setting but in the midst of conflict, a declaration of intent that cut through pretense to the heart of the matter. "Impossible," Lord Blackwood finally managed, the single word emerging strangled and harsh. "The Hayes and Blackwood lines will never be joined while I draw breath. I would see her in her grave before I would see her as your wife." Lady Blackwood cried out softly at this cruel statement, half rising from her chair in distress before sinking back, her strength unequal to the emotional demands of the moment. Alexander did not flinch at the brutal declaration, his gaze remaining steady as he addressed Lord Blackwood with perfect composure. "Your hatred blinds you, sir, to your daughter's well-being and happiness. I had hoped to appeal to your better nature, but I see now that such an approach would be futile." He turned slightly toward Eleanor, his expression softening as their eyes met across the charged space between them. "I love your daughter, Lord Blackwood, not as some instrument of revenge or tool of family politics, but for her mind, her spirit, and her character. I believe she returns that regard, and I am prepared to overcome any obstacle to secure our future together." Eleanor felt her heart swell almost painfully within her chest at this public declaration, tears gathering in her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming intensity of emotion that flooded through her at Alexander's words. The truth of his statement resonated in her very being, crystallizing the confused feelings of recent weeks into absolute certainty. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "I do return his regard, father. I love him." Lord Blackwood recoiled as if struck, his expression contorting with disbelief and betrayal as he stared at his daughter. "You know nothing of love," he spat, years of paternal authority crumbling before this unprecedented defiance. "You are a foolish girl who has been seduced by pretty words and false promises. I will never consent to this match. Never." Alexander moved then, crossing the space that separated him from Eleanor with deliberate steps, coming to stand beside her in silent support and tacit alliance. They faced Lord Blackwood together, their proximity an unspoken statement of unity that further enraged the older man, whose hands clenched into fists at his sides as he witnessed this visual representation of his daughter's transfer of loyalty. "If you touch her, I will have you removed from my property by force," he threatened, gesturing toward the bell pull that would summon servants. Alexander remained unmoved by this threat, his position beside Eleanor maintained without physical contact, yet conveying absolute commitment. "I am well aware of the legal realities, Lord Blackwood," he stated evenly. "You have the right to withhold consent until Eleanor reaches her majority. However," he continued, his voice taking on a new note of authority that reminded all present of his ducal rank, "I am equally aware that your financial situation has become increasingly precarious in recent years, a circumstance that makes your daughter's marriage prospects a matter of some urgency for your family's continued comfort." Lord Blackwood blanched at this direct reference to private matters he had taken pains to conceal, while Eleanor turned to Alexander with surprise. This particular aspect of her father's concerns having never been explicitly shared with her, despite her growing awareness of economies introduced to the household. "I am prepared to be generous in matters of settlements and allowances," Alexander continued, pressing his advantage as Lord Blackwood struggled to formulate a response. "Far more generous than any other suitor within your daughter's acquaintance could possibly be. Consider carefully whether your personal animosity is worth the sacrifice of both your daughter's happiness and your family's financial security." The calculated appeal to Lord Blackwood's self-interest hung in the air between them, a pragmatic counterpoint to the emotional declarations that had preceded it. Eleanor held her breath, witnessing her father wrestle visibly with conflicting imperatives of pride, practicality, and paternal authority, the outcome of this internal struggle promising to determine the course of her future life and happiness. The sudden silence that followed Alexander's pragmatic appeal, stretched taut as a bowstring, with all attention fixed on Lord Blackwood, whose expression had shifted from outright fury to calculated assessment as he weighed the Duke's financial proposition against his personal hatred. Eleanor watched her father's face with growing apprehension, the realization dawning that he might indeed sacrifice her happiness to satisfy his pride, or conversely, sacrifice his pride for financial advantage, without any consideration for her feelings in the matter. Just as Lord Blackwood opened his mouth to deliver what promised to be another blistering refusal, a voice spoke from the direction of the dining table, so unexpected that it momentarily redirected everyone's attention. "Enough, William," Lady Blackwood said, her usually soft, tentative tone replaced by something firmer and more resolute as she slowly rose to her feet, one hand braced against the polished mahogany for support. Eleanor stared at her mother in astonishment, unable to recall the last time she had witnessed the frail woman directly contradict her husband on any matter, let alone intervene in a confrontation of such magnitude. Lady Blackwood stood with surprising dignity despite her evident physical weakness, her spine straightening, as if casting off years of habitual submission, along with the shawl that slipped from her shoulders to pool forgotten on her chair. "I have remained silent for too many years while you allowed ancient history to poison our family's present and future. I will be silent no longer." Lord Blackwood appeared as shocked as his daughter by this unprecedented rebellion from his customarily acquiescent wife. "Margaret, this does not concern you," he began, his tone automatically assuming the dismissive authority that had served him for decades of marriage. But Lady Blackwood continued as if he had not spoken, her eyes fixed on Alexander with an intensity that suggested she saw something beyond his physical presence, perhaps glimpsing the shadow of his father in his features. "The quarrel between our families has never been about politics or court appointments," she stated clearly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "It has always been about Catherine Hayes, your mother, and William's inability to accept her rejection of his suit in favor of your father's." The revelation fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through all present. Eleanor gasped audibly, her understanding of family history restructuring itself around this new information, while Alexander's eyebrows rose in evident surprise. This particular detail, apparently absent from even his knowledge of the feud. "It is a lie," Lord Blackwood snarled, though the heightened color in his face and the way his eyes avoided his wife's steady gaze suggested otherwise. Lady Blackwood shook her head slowly, her expression one of weary patience rather than triumph. "No, William, it is the truth that has haunted our marriage from its earliest days. You courted Catherine Sinclair with every expectation of success, given your family's position and fortune. When she chose Jeremiah Hayes instead, your wounded pride transformed into a vendetta that has spanned decades, tainting everything it touched, including your relationship with our daughter. She turned to Eleanor, her eyes softening with maternal tenderness. I married your father, believing his heart would heal with time, that the birth of children would help him forget his first love. Instead, I watched him nurture his grievance like a cherished possession, allowing it to overshadow our family's happiness and poison his view of an innocent young man whose only crime is to be born of the woman who rejected him. The dining room had transformed entirely, the abandoned meal and formal setting now incongruous beneath the weight of these long-buried truths laid bare for examination. The servants had discreetly withdrawn, sensing that this family confession required privacy, though undoubtedly they listened from just beyond the doors, ensuring tomorrow's whispers would spread through the county like wildfire. Is this true, Father? Eleanor asked softly, the pieces of a lifelong puzzle finally arranging themselves into a coherent picture that explained so much of her father's behavior, his obsessive hatred of the Hayes family, his controlling nature, and his particular vehemence regarding Alexander's interest in her. Lord Blackwood remained silent, his posture rigid with humiliation at having this most private defeat exposed before the very man whose existence represented that ancient rejection. His lack of denial confirmed the truth of his wife's account more definitively than any words could have done. Alexander processed this revelation with remarkable composure, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant as he assessed its implications for both the past conflict and their present situation. The animosity between our families has been based not on political rivalry or professional sabotage, but on a personal matter of the heart, he said finally, his tone measured and free from mockery. A young woman's choice made decades ago continues to determine the happiness of the next generation. His gaze met Eleanor's across the small space that separated them, conveying without words his understanding of the parallels between their current circumstances and that long-ago romantic triangle. History need not repeat itself, Lady Blackwood said quietly, her momentary strength beginning to fade as she sank back into her chair, the effort of her unprecedented stand clearly taxing her limited reserves. Eleanor, come here, child. Eleanor moved to her mother's side, kneeling beside her chair and taking her cold hand between her own warmer ones, aware that something fundamental had shifted in their family dynamic through this unexpected intervention and revelation. William, Lady Blackwood continued, addressing her husband directly, you have lived in the shadow of rejection for nearly 30 years. Will you now inflict that same pain on your own daughter by forcing her from the man she loves? Or will you finally release this bitterness that has robbed us all of so much joy? The night settled over Blackwood Manor like a somber blanket, moonlight filtering through scattered clouds to cast shifting patterns across the gardens that Eleanor had tended so carefully. In her bedchamber, she moved with deliberate purpose, opening drawers and selecting only the most essential items to place in a small traveling case that had belonged to her grandmother. The events of the dining room confrontation had concluded not with resolution but with exhaustion, Lord Blackwood ultimately retreating to his study in stony silence while Alexander reluctantly departed with a promise to return on the morrow, the question of their future left precariously suspended between possibility and prohibition. Eleanor folded a simple muslin dress and placed it carefully atop the modest collection of belongings she had deemed necessary for whatever uncertain path lay ahead, her movements methodical despite the tumult of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The bedroom that had sheltered her for 21 years suddenly seemed both familiar and foreign, its comfortable furnishings and personal mementos representing a life lived within carefully prescribed boundaries that she now contemplated abandoning. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her preparations, causing her to hastily close the traveling case and slide it beneath her bed before calling permission to enter. Lady Blackwood appeared in the doorway, her frail form supported by a walking cane she rarely employed in company, a concession to weakness that spoke volumes about her physical and emotional exhaustion following the unprecedented stand she had taken at dinner. Eleanor, she said softly, her gaze traveling knowingly to the partially visible case beneath the bed frame. "I thought I might find you thus engaged." Eleanor moved quickly to help her mother to the small settee beneath the window, settling her comfortably against the cushions before kneeling at her feet in a position reminiscent of childhood confidences shared in this same spot over the years. "Forgive me, Mama," she whispered, clasping her mother's thin hands in her own. "I cannot bear to remain under this roof another night, not after what was revealed, not with Father's hatred poisoning every interaction. Alexander has proposed, and while I know I should wait for proper permission, I fear such approval will never come regardless of any financial advantages the match might offer our family." Lady Blackwood stroked her daughter's cheek with tender understanding, her eyes reflecting not censure but compassion. "Your father has trapped himself in a prison of his own making, Eleanor. I would not see you similarly confined by his bitterness." Her gaze drifted toward the window and the moonlit grounds beyond, perhaps seeing ghosts of her own youthful choices and compromises. "I married William believing love would grow between us despite his heart belonging elsewhere. I was wrong, and that mistake has shaped our entire family's existence." Eleanor leaned into her mother's touch, drawing strength from this unexpected alliance. "I have always done what was expected," she said, her voice gaining conviction with each word. "I have been the dutiful daughter in all things, subjugated my own desires to Father's will without question or complaint." Her eyes met her mother's directly, the moonlight illuminating the determination in their grey depths. "I've lived my life according to Father's wishes. This once, I must follow my heart." She rose and retrieved the travelling case from its inadequate hiding place, placing it on the bed and securing its fastenings with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. "Alexander will come at dawn. He has arranged for his mother's companion to travel with us to ensure propriety, but we will depart with or without Father's blessing." Lady Blackwood nodded slowly, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her expression as she contemplated her daughter's choice and its inevitable consequences. "I cannot accompany you, Eleanor. My place remains here, however difficult that path may be. But know this," she continued, reaching for Eleanor's hand once more, "you carry my blessing and my love wherever your journey leads." Her fingers pressed something cool and metallic into Eleanor's palm, a small gold locket that had been her own mother's, a family treasure that represented generations of Blackwood women. "For courage," she whispered, "and to remember that not all family bonds are meant to constrain." Eleanor closed her fingers around this unexpected gift, tears filling her eyes at its significance, this tangible symbol of maternal support for her unprecedented defiance of paternal authority. She helped her mother to her feet, embracing her with careful tenderness that acknowledged both her physical fragility and her surprising emotional strength. "I will write to you," she promised, inhaling the familiar lavender scent of her mother's shawl, committing it to memory alongside this moment of connection that transcended their previously reserved relationship. As Lady Blackwood made her way slowly to the door, she paused with her hand on the latch, turning back to regard her daughter with an expression of quiet pride. "Love freely chosen is worth any sacrifice, Eleanor. Never doubt the truth of your own heart." With those words, she departed, leaving Eleanor alone with the moonlight, her modest preparations, and the weight of the choice she had made. A decision that represented not just the selection of one future over another, but the first true assertion of her own identity separate from the role she had been raised to fill, the dutiful daughter, transformed through love and courage, into a woman determining her own destiny. Dawn had not yet broken when Eleanor slipped silently from Blackwood Manor through the servants' entrance, Jane following close behind with the small travelling case, both women moving with the furtive caution of escapees despite Eleanor's conviction in the rightness of her decision. The eastern sky had just begun to lighten with the first suggestion of approaching sunrise as they reached the sheltered copse where Alexander had promised to wait with his carriage. The vehicle's dark outline barely visible among the trees, its presence confirming that the events of the previous day had not been some fevered dream, but the beginning of an irrevocable change in the course of her life. Alexander stepped forward as they approached, his face revealing mingled concern and relief at their appearance, his eyes quickly scanning the path behind them for any sign of pursuit or discovery. The carriage door stood open, revealing a middle-aged woman with a kind face and practical traveling clothes whom he introduced briefly as Mrs. Winters, his mother's companion of many years, her presence ensuring the minimal requirements of propriety during their journey. Within moments, Eleanor's bag was secured. Jane was tearfully embracing her mistress in farewell after declining the invitation to accompany them, and Eleanor found herself seated opposite Alexander in the carriage's dimly lit interior as they began their journey away from the only home she had ever known, the rapid hoofbeats of the matched greys creating a rhythm that matched the accelerated beating of her heart. They traveled in silence initially, each absorbed in private reflections as the carriage made its way along country lanes, still shrouded in the half-light of earliest morning, Mrs. Winters discreetly feigning sleep against the opposite cushions to allow them a measure of privacy within the confines of propriety. Alexander watched Eleanor's face as she gazed out the window at the passing landscape, her profile illuminated by the gradually strengthening light of dawn, her expression a complex mixture of resolve, apprehension, and something that might have been hope, despite the circumstances of their departure. "Did you encounter any difficulties in leaving?" he asked. Finally, his voice kept low to avoid disturbing Mrs. Winters, though Eleanor suspected the companion's slumber was more diplomatic than genuine. "None," she replied, turning from the window to meet his concerned gaze. "My mother came to my room last night. She knows of my decision and gave me her blessing, though she will remain at Blackwood Manor with father." Alexander nodded, his expression revealing both respect for Lady Blackwood's unexpected strength and genuine relief at Eleanor's relatively uncomplicated escape. "I confess I feared Lord Blackwood might have posted guards or taken other measures to prevent your departure after our confrontation. He would never imagine I possessed the courage to leave of my own accord," Eleanor said with a small, sad smile that acknowledged the limited view her father had always held of her capabilities and determination. "Despite my actions yesterday, he still believes me the dutiful daughter who has never challenged his authority in 21 years of existence." She smoothed her traveling dress with gloved hands, a nervous gesture that betrayed her awareness of the magnitude of the step she had taken. "Even now, part of me can scarcely credit my own temerity." Alexander regarded her with evident admiration, reaching across the space between them to take her hand in a gesture that would have been scandalously forward mere days ago, but now seemed natural given all that had transpired between them. "Your courage humbles me, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Few women of my acquaintance would risk family, reputation, and security for the sake of their own heart's conviction." His thumb traced a gentle pattern against her gloved palm, the simple contact sending warmth through her despite the early morning chill within the carriage. She studied his face in the strengthening light, noting the fatigue etched around his eyes that suggested a sleepless night, yet also the steadfast determination in his expression that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. "I have been wondering," she ventured after a comfortable silence, "what first drew your attention to me? At the Harrington ball you noticed me across the room before we ever spoke. Was it merely curiosity about the daughter of your family's enemy?" Alexander's expression shifted, a hint of something almost like embarrassment crossing his features before he replied. "My interest began well before the Harrington ball, Eleanor, though I had no opportunity to act upon it until that night." Her surprise must have shown clearly on her face, for he continued with greater assurance, settling back against the carriage cushions while maintaining his gentle hold on her hand. 3 years ago, before my time abroad, I attended the Midsummer Festival in the village near Blackwood Manor. You were there with your parents, though I doubted you noticed me among the crowd. During the festivities, an elderly servant woman stumbled and dropped a tray of refreshments meant for your father's party. While Lord Blackwood berated the poor woman for her clumsiness, you knelt beside her despite your fine dress, helping her gather the scattered glasses and speaking words of comfort that brought a smile to her weathered face. Alexander's expression softened with the recollection, his gaze holding Eleanor's with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment of simple kindness, I glimpsed a spirit at odds with everything I had been told about the Blackwood family. That image stayed with me throughout my travels, a counterpoint to the bitterness that had colored relations between our families for generations. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this unexpected revelation, this moment of ordinary compassion she had long forgotten, having apparently planted the first seed of their current connection. "You remembered such a small incident for 3 years?" she asked softly, both touched and slightly overwhelmed by the implication. "It revealed your true character more clearly than any formal introduction or social exchange ever could," Alexander replied simply. "When I returned to England and heard you would be at the Harrington ball, I arranged my own invitation specifically in hopes of making your acquaintance properly." The quiet confession hung between them in the intimate space of the carriage, illuminating their connection in a new light that suggested their meeting had been less chance and more destiny than either had previously acknowledged. It seemed to Eleanor that in this revelation lay the final confirmation that their current path, however unconventional and fraught with uncertainty, represented not merely rebellion against her father's tyranny, but movement toward something genuine and precious that deserved protection regardless of the cost. The journey from Blackwood Manor to their destination took most of the day, the carriage traveling steadily northward through the verdant Hampshire countryside. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the rolling landscape, they turned onto a private lane bordered by ancient oaks, whose spreading branches formed a natural archway overhead. Eleanor, weary from travel and emotional exhaustion, roused herself from a light doze to peer through the window as they approached a honey-colored stone house nestled among carefully tended gardens, its elegant proportions suggesting wealth without ostentation, its warm glow in the late afternoon light immediately conveying a sense of sanctuary after their long journey. "This is Rosemont Cottage," Alexander explained as the carriage slowed, the irony in his voice evident as he named what was clearly a substantial manor house rather than any true cottage. "My mother has lived here since my father's death, preferring its comfortable scale to the main estate at Westmoreland Park. The Duchess Dowager keeps only a small staff, but you will find every comfort and, most importantly, absolute security." Eleanor smoothed her travel-rumpled dress as the carriage came to a stop before a wide stone entrance, her nervous anticipation at meeting Alexander's mother momentarily overriding her physical discomfort after hours of travel. Mrs. Winters stirred from her diplomatically maintained sleep, arranging her own attire with practiced efficiency before offering Eleanor an encouraging smile. "The Duchess Dowager is a most understanding woman, Miss Blackwood. You have nothing to fear from her reception." Before Eleanor could respond, the heavy oak door of Rosemont opened to reveal an elegant woman in her 50s, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged in a simple but fashionable style, her bearing regal, without affectation, as she descended the shallow steps to greet them. Alexander stepped down from the carriage and embraced his mother with obvious affection before turning to assist Eleanor, his steadying hand on hers communicating silent reassurance as she faced this crucial introduction. "Mother, may I present Miss Eleanor Blackwood," he said formally, though the warmth in his voice belied the proper phrasing. "Eleanor, Her Grace, Catherine Hayes, Duchess Dowager of Westmoreland." The older woman's penetrating gaze assessed Eleanor with intelligent interest, rather than the suspicion or hostility she might have expected given the history between their families. Her eyes, the same rich brown as her son's, reflected not judgment but genuine curiosity as Eleanor executed a perfect curtsy, her years of training serving her well, despite her travel fatigue and nervous apprehension. "So you're the young woman brave enough to heal the rift between our families," the Duchess said, her voice melodious and cultured, with a hint of warmth that immediately eased Eleanor's tension. She stepped forward and took Eleanor's gloved hands in her own. "Welcome to Rosemont, my dear. You must be exhausted after your journey and the undoubtedly dramatic circumstances of your departure." The perceptiveness of this observation, coupled with the genuine welcome in the older woman's manner, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes, the accumulated strain of the past 24 hours, suddenly overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. The Duchess seemed to understand without explanation, gently placing a maternal arm around Eleanor's shoulders and guiding her toward the house with practiced ease. "Come inside, child." A warm fire, a light meal, and perhaps a restorative cup of tea will do wonders for your spirits before any serious discussions are undertaken. The interior of Rosemont proved as welcoming as its mistress, with polished wood floors softened by richly colored rugs, comfortable furnishings arranged for conversation rather than formal display, and everywhere evidence of a life well lived in the form of books, musical instruments, and tasteful mementos from distant travels. A cheerful fire burned in the drawing-room hearth, its golden light complementing the warm cream and sage tones of the walls and upholstery, creating an atmosphere of immediate comfort that enveloped Eleanor like a physical embrace after the tension and uncertainty of recent events. As promised, tea arrived promptly, followed by a light but nourishing meal served without fuss by the small but efficient household staff. Throughout, the Duchess maintained easy conversation that required little response from Eleanor beyond appreciative murmurs, her social skills allowing her to perceive exactly what her unexpected guest required most in this moment of transition. It was only after Eleanor had been shown to a lovely guest chamber to refresh herself, and later rejoined the Duchess and Alexander in a small family parlour for evening tea, that more serious matters were addressed. "Alexander has written to me of the situation with your father," the Duchess said directly, setting aside her teacup with purposeful precision. "Having known William Blackwood in my youth, I can well imagine the scene that preceded your departure. I must confess to some surprise, however, at learning that our family's infamous feud originated with my rejection of his suit all those years ago. I had thought that particular chapter long forgotten by everyone but myself." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this frank acknowledgement of the personal history underlying decades of hostility between their families. "The revelation was as surprising to me as it appears to have been to Alexander," she admitted finally. "My father never spoke of it, presenting your husband's actions at court as the sole cause of enmity between our houses." The Duchess's expression softened with something like compassion. "William always did excel at reconstructing history to protect his pride," she observed, though without malice. "It is unfortunate that such a youthful disappointment should have poisoned so many lives for so long." Her gaze moved between Eleanor and her son, who had remained quietly attentive during this exchange. Perhaps now, through you both, that poison might finally be purged. Alexander reached for Eleanor's hand, the gesture natural and protective in the sanctuary of his mother's home, where social conventions might be temporarily relaxed in favor of genuine emotion. "I intend to marry Eleanor regardless of Lord Blackwood's objections," he stated with quiet determination. "We will observe all proper forms that circumstances permit, but I will not relinquish her to satisfy an ancient grudge." The Duchess nodded, unsurprised by this declaration. "You shall have my complete support, naturally, but we must proceed with care." She turned her attention fully to Eleanor, her expression serious but kind. "This house stands ready as your sanctuary for as long as necessary, my dear. Here you may find the space to determine your own heart's true direction without your father's influence, or indeed," she added with a pointed glance toward her son, "without the pressure of Alexander's quite evident devotion, potentially overwhelming your own careful consideration." The unexpected fairness of this statement, this acknowledgement that Eleanor deserved time to confirm her own feelings, independent of external pressures, brought a rush of gratitude that momentarily robbed her of speech. When she found her voice, it emerged steadier and more confident than she might have expected after such an emotionally turbulent day. "You are most generous, Your Grace," she replied formally, before allowing her true feelings to emerge in more personal terms. "I cannot adequately express what your welcome means to me, particularly given the circumstances of my arrival and the history between our families. I know my own mind and heart in this matter, but I deeply appreciate your understanding that such important decisions deserve the confirmation of calm reflection." The Duchess smiled with evident approval at this response, rising from her chair with the subtle indication that the evening's serious discussion had reached its natural conclusion. "You have had enough of weighty matters for one day, I think. Tomorrow is soon enough to consider practical arrangements and future plans." She approached Eleanor, and, in a gesture reminiscent of Lady Blackwood's parting the previous night, lightly touched her cheek with maternal gentleness. "Rest well, Eleanor Blackwood. You are safe here, and welcome for as long as you choose to remain." 5 days passed at Rosemont in relative tranquility, days that allowed Eleanor to recover from the emotional upheaval of her departure from Blackwood Manor and begin to envision the life that might await her as Alexander's wife. The Duchess Dowager proved an ideal hostess, providing companionship when desired, but also respecting Eleanor's need for solitude and reflection, her understanding manner further confirming the rightness of Eleanor's decision to follow her heart, despite paternal opposition. Alexander divided his time between Rosemont and necessary business at Westmoreland Park, ensuring that proper preparations were underway for their marriage, while scrupulously observing the proprieties suggested by his mother regarding their interactions during this liminal period before their formal union. It was during afternoon tea on the 5th day, as Eleanor sat with the Duchess in the morning room overlooking the rose garden, that the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, approaching at a speed that suggested urgency rather than social convention. Both women glanced toward the window, the Duchess setting down her teacup with deliberate calm that belied the sudden tension in her posture as she recognized the Blackwood family crest emblazoned on the carriage door. "Lord Blackwood has discovered your whereabouts more quickly than I anticipated," she observed, rising with elegant efficiency to pull the bell for Simmons, her butler. Eleanor felt her hard-won peace evaporate instantly, replaced by a cold dread that settled in her stomach like lead as she contemplated facing her father's wrath after her unprecedented defiance. The Duchess seemed to read her thoughts, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder as they moved toward the formal drawing room, a space more suitable for the confrontation to come. "You need not face him alone, my dear. This is my house, and you are under my protection regardless of William Blackwood's bluster. Alexander is expected within the hour," she added, her calm practicality offering reassurance where empty platitudes would have failed. "But I think we shall manage quite effectively without him, do you not?" The drawing room of Rosemont, though less frequently used than the more comfortable family parlor, maintained the general air of welcoming elegance that characterized the house, with tall windows admitting abundant light, comfortable furnishings arranged to facilitate conversation, and tasteful art adorning the silk-papered walls. Eleanor took her position beside the Duchess's chair, determined to present a united front against whatever accusations or demands her father might bring, her posture erect and her hands clasped before her to disguise their slight trembling. Lord Blackwood entered like an approaching storm, his tall frame rigid with barely contained fury as he strode into the room without waiting for proper announcement, his travel clothes bearing evidence of a hasty journey undertaken with minimal preparation. "Margaret," he acknowledged curtly, using the Duchess's given name with deliberate disregard for proper address, a slight that the older woman appeared to note, but choose to ignore. "I have come for my daughter, who has been spirited away through manipulation and false promises." The Duchess remained seated, her composure unruffled by his aggressive entrance or accusatory tone. "William," she replied with perfect equanimity, "Eleanor has sought temporary refuge in my home while considering her future. She is here of her own free will and may leave whenever she chooses." She gestured toward a chair opposite her own. "Perhaps you might join us for a more civilized discussion of the situation." Lord Blackwood ignored the offered seat, his gaze shifting to Eleanor with cold assessment that searched for signs of weakness or regret he might exploit. "I see my daughter has been thoroughly coached in this performance of independence," he observed with bitter sarcasm. "How quickly the dutiful child becomes the defiant woman when sufficient temptation is offered." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this crude implication regarding her character and motivations, but before she could formulate a response, the Duchess intervened with quiet authority. "Your daughter has conducted herself with perfect propriety throughout her stay at Rosemont, William. If you have come merely to cast aspersions on her character or mine, I fear you have wasted your journey." Lord Blackwood's expression hardened further, his strategy shifting in response to this unified resistance to his intimidation. "I have not come to debate Eleanor's virtue or lack thereof," he stated flatly. "I have come to inform the Duke of Westmoreland that should he persist in this ill-advised pursuit, certain information regarding his financial dealings in Vienna during his time abroad will become public knowledge. The threat hung in the air between them, its implications clear, despite its lack of specifics. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sudden fear, not for herself but for Alexander and his reputation, this new attack representing a more dangerous form of retaliation than simple parental disapproval. "What information?" she asked, her voice steadier than she had expected, determined not to be excluded from a conversation that so directly affected her future. Lord Blackwood's thin smile suggested satisfaction at having found a pressure point that might prove effective where direct commands had failed. Records indicating substantial losses at gaming tables, significant debts to questionable characters, and behavior unbecoming a peer of the realm, he replied with evident pleasure in delivering this blow. All documented by reliable witnesses whose testimony would prove most damaging to the Duke's standing in society and at court. The Duchess rose from her chair with deliberate grace, her expression revealing nothing of whatever concerns this accusation might have raised. "Those are serious allegations, William," she acknowledged calmly. "And if true, they would indeed cause considerable difficulty for my son. However," she continued, moving to stand directly before Lord Blackwood with surprising fearlessness given the disparity in their physical stature, as Alexander spent the entirety of his time in Vienna, in the company of the British ambassador, who has already provided written testimony regarding his exemplary conduct during that period, "I fear your mysterious witnesses may find their credibility somewhat compromised." She paused, allowing this information to register before delivering her counterstroke. "I wonder how the Lord Chancellor might view such a deliberate attempt to damage the reputation of a peer through demonstrably false accusations. A question that might bear consideration before you proceed with this particular strategy." Lord Blackwood's momentary flash of uncertainty revealed that this particular gambit had been based more on desperate hope than actual evidence, his knowledge of Alexander's time abroad apparently consisting of rumor rather than verifiable fact. His recovery was swift, however, as he turned his attention back to Eleanor with renewed determination. "You will return to Blackwood Manor immediately," he commanded, his tone reverting to the paternal authority that had governed her entire existence until recent days. "This childish rebellion has gone on quite long enough. I have indulged your tantrum out of consideration for your mother's distress, but my patience is at an end." Eleanor stood firm beside the Duchess, drawing strength from the older woman's quiet support, and her own growing conviction in the rightness of her chosen path. "I am not a child to be commanded, father," she replied with gentle firmness that contained no hint of the defiance he might have expected. "I am a woman of 21 years, who has made a considered choice regarding her own future. That choice includes Alexander Hayes, whom I love and intend to marry with or without your blessing." The simple declaration of her intentions, delivered without drama or excessive emotion, seemed to impact Lord Blackwood more profoundly than any passionate outburst might have done, forcing him to confront the reality that his daughter had indeed transformed from the obedient child he had always controlled into a woman capable of determining her own destiny. The confrontation in the drawing room had ended in stalemate, Lord Blackwood refusing to accept Eleanor's decision, yet finding himself unable to enforce his will in the Duchess Dowager's domain. He had retreated to the guest chamber reluctantly offered by the Duchess, ostensibly to refresh himself after his journey before continuing discussions the following day, though all present recognized this as a face-saving measure that merely postponed the inevitable acknowledgement of his daughter's independence. Evening descended on Rosemont, bringing with it the sweet fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and the gentle chorus of early summer insects, a peaceful counterpoint to the emotional tensions still resonating through the household. Eleanor found herself unable to remain indoors despite the late hour, drawn to the gardens where she might find the space to gather her thoughts and strength for the confrontation she knew must come. She walked the gravel paths illuminated by moonlight, her unescorted wandering itself a small act of freedom that would have been impossible at Blackwood Manor. The formal gardens of Rosemont gave way to a more naturalistic landscape as she moved farther from the house, finding solace in the wild beauty of nature allowed to flourish with only gentle guidance rather than strict control. A stone bench positioned beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak offered a resting place that seemed to invite contemplation, its weathered surface cool beneath her fingertips, as she seated herself to gaze across the moonlit landscape. It was here that Lord Blackwood found her some half-hour later, his approach deliberate enough to signal his presence before he emerged from the shadowed path, a consideration that represented his first acknowledgement, however small, of her status as something other than an errant child requiring supervision. "Eleanor," he began, his voice less commanding than it had been in the drawing room, though still carrying the expectation of authority that had characterized their relationship since her earliest memories. "Your mother is most distressed by your absence." She felt neither surprise nor guilt at this predictable appeal to familial obligation, recognizing it as merely the opening gambit in what promised to be his final attempt to reassert control over her life. "Mother understands my reasons for leaving," she replied calmly, remaining seated rather than rising as respect would normally have dictated. "She gave me her blessing, and this locket as a token of her support." She touched the small gold piece that hung at her throat, visible in the moonlight that filtered through the oak's branches. Lord Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly at this evidence of his wife's unexpected alliance with their daughter's rebellion. "Margaret has always been overly sentimental where you are concerned," he observed dismissively. "She fails to recognize the practical considerations that must guide family decisions." Eleanor studied her father in the silvery light, seeing him with new clarity that recent events had granted her. The man who had loomed so large throughout her life suddenly appeared diminished, his imposing stature reduced by the revelation of the personal weakness that had driven decades of bitterness and control. "I understand those considerations more clearly now, Father," she said quietly. "I understand that your hatred for the Hayes family stems not from political rivalry or professional sabotage, but from Duchess Catherine's rejection of your suit all those years ago." He flinched visibly at this direct reference to the humiliation he had spent decades concealing, his expression hardening into the cold mask of authority that had always silenced her questions and crushed her burgeoning independence. "You understand nothing," he snapped, his composure momentarily fractured by her unprecedented directness. "You are a foolish girl being manipulated by a man seeking revenge for imagined slights between our families." "I understand enough," Eleanor countered, rising from the bench to stand before him, no longer the dutiful daughter awaiting instruction, but a woman claiming her right to self-determination. "I understand that you have allowed an ancient rejection to poison not only your relationship with the Hayes family, but also your marriage to Mother and your treatment of me." Each word struck with the precision of a surgeon's blade, exposing the festering wounds that had shaped their family dynamic for decades. "You've controlled me through fear all my life, Father. No more. Your bitterness has poisoned our family long enough." Lord Blackwood seemed to grow smaller with each statement, his habitual authority undermined by these simple truths spoken without melodrama or excessive emotion, merely stated as the objective reality that Eleanor now perceived with painful clarity. "How dare you speak to me this way?" he managed, though the words lacked their usual force, emerging instead as the protest of a man confronting the crumbling of a carefully constructed facade. "I dare because I must," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I dare because I have glimpsed the possibility of a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than duty and fear. I dare because Alexander has shown me that love need not be a transaction or a power struggle, but a partnership between equals." The moonlight illuminated her face as she spoke, revealing a strength and certainty that transformed her familiar features into something new and formidable. A woman standing in her own truth without apology or hesitation. Lord Blackwood stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, his expression shifting from indignation to something approaching reluctant recognition of the transformation before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment beneath its remaining veneer of authority. "I have provided everything for you, Eleanor. Education, comfort, social position, all the advantages my position could secure. And yet you would throw away the future I planned for you, the security I have worked to ensure, for this romantic fancy that will surely fade with time." His incomprehension was so evident, so clearly genuine, that Eleanor felt a surprising surge of compassion for this man, who had ruled her life with such rigid control, yet apparently never truly understood her as an individual separate from his own expectations and ambitions. "That is the fundamental difference between us, Father," she said gently. "You see love as a dangerous weakness, a vulnerability to be avoided at all costs, since your own heart was wounded in youth. I see it as the greatest strength one can possess, the courage to risk pain for the possibility of genuine connection. You sought to protect me from life's disappointments by controlling every aspect of my existence. But in doing so, you denied me the opportunity to discover my own resilience, to learn that heartbreak, while painful, need not define one's entire existence as it has defined yours." Lord Blackwood's shoulders seemed to sag beneath the weight of her words, the rigid posture that had intimidated Eleanor throughout her childhood, giving way to something that hinted at the fatigue of maintaining such implacable opposition to genuine human connection for so many years. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, the question itself representing a seismic shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that her wishes now carried weight in determining their future interactions. "I would have you release your grip on ancient grievances, Father," she answered simply. "I would have you consider that your daughter's happiness might matter more than your pride or your need to control the future. I would have you recognize that Alexander Hayes is a good and honorable man whose only crime is to be born of the woman who once rejected your suit." She paused, gathering courage for her final declaration of independence. "But regardless of what you choose, know this: I will marry Alexander, with or without your blessing. The choice now rests with you whether to remain part of my life or to allow your bitterness to sever our connection entirely." The morning after Eleanor's moonlit confrontation with her father dawned with tentative sunlight filtering through scattered clouds, a fitting metaphor for the uncertain state of relations between the primary residents and visitors of Rosemont. Lord Blackwood had retreated to his assigned guest chamber without further argument following their garden exchange, his uncharacteristic silence more unsettling to Eleanor than continued opposition might have been, leaving her to wonder whether she had witnessed the beginning of acceptance or merely a tactical withdrawal before renewed assault. Alexander had returned late the previous evening, receiving a hushed account of both confrontations from Eleanor and his mother, before expressing his determination to seek a private audience with Lord Blackwood the following day, a proposal the Duchess had gently but firmly vetoed with experienced diplomacy. "A letter has arrived from your mother," the Duchess informed Eleanor as they shared a quiet breakfast in the morning room, Alexander having departed for a brief consultation with his solicitor regarding marriage arrangements. She approached the situation with characteristic directness, declining to soften potentially distressing news with social niceties. It was delivered by her personal maid rather than the regular post, suggesting some degree of urgency or secrecy. Eleanor accepted the folded paper with trembling fingers, recognizing her mother's elegant handwriting and the faint scent of lavender that clung to the page, a small sensory connection to home that unexpectedly tightened her throat with emotion. The contents proved brief but significant. Lady Blackwood expressing her continued support for Eleanor's decision, while revealing that she had finally confronted her husband regarding his decades of emotional neglect stemming from his lingering attachment to the Duchess. "Catherine," she concluded with a plea that Eleanor make one final attempt at reconciliation before proceeding with her marriage, not for her own sake, but for Lord Blackwood's, whose pride might prevent him from acknowledging his errors without assistance. Eleanor shared the letter with the Duchess, who read it with thoughtful attention before setting it aside with careful precision. "Your mother is a wiser woman than William ever deserved," she observed quietly, "and perhaps braver than any of us recognized until recent events forced her hand." She rose from the breakfast table with sudden decision, smoothing her morning dress with practiced elegance. "I believe the time has come for my own conversation with your father, Eleanor. There are aspects of our shared history that may shed additional light on current circumstances." Eleanor looked up in surprise, sensing some undercurrent of meaning beneath the Duchess's carefully modulated tone. "Might I accompany you?" she asked, curiosity mingling with concern at what revelations might emerge from such an encounter. The Duchess considered the request with evident deliberation before nodding slowly. "Perhaps that would be best," she agreed. "Some truths benefit from witnesses who might carry their lessons forward to future generations." They found Lord Blackwood in the Duchess's private study, where he had apparently been admitted at his own request to examine family papers relating to the ancient property dispute he had long cited as additional justification for enmity between their families. The room reflected its owner's refined taste and intellectual interests, with walls lined with well-used books, a substantial desk positioned to capture optimal light from tall windows overlooking the garden, and family portraits arranged in chronological sequence that created a visual history of the Hayes lineage. Lord Blackwood looked up from the leather-bound volume he had been examining, his expression guarded as the two women entered this most personal of the Duchess's domains, his gaze lingering momentarily on the portrait of the late Duke that hung in the position of honor above the fireplace. "William," the Duchess began without preamble, dispensing with formal address in favor of direct engagement, "I believe the time has come to speak plainly about matters long buried beneath decades of pretense and misdirection. As Eleanor is now irreversibly committed to her future with my son, we owe her and Alexander the truth about the origins of this feud that has shadowed both our families for so long." Lord Blackwood's expression remained carefully neutral, though the slight whitening of his knuckles as he closed the volume before him suggested internal tension at this direct approach. "I believe my daughter has already been informed of the relevant history by her mother, whose discretion appears to have abandoned her after 20 years of appropriate silence." The Duchess moved further into the room, positioning herself beside a portrait of herself as a young woman, painted shortly after her marriage to Jeremiah Hayes, the resemblance between the youthful image and her current appearance still evident, despite the passage of time. "Your rejection of my choice was never the entirety of the story, William," she said quietly. "You know as well as I that our history began much earlier, when we were scarcely more than children ourselves." Eleanor observed her father's face with growing curiosity as something shifted in his expression, a subtle fracturing of the rigid control he had maintained throughout her lifetime, revealing a glimpse of the young man who had existed before bitterness and pride hardened into his defining characteristics. "We need not revisit ancient history, Catherine," he replied stiffly, avoiding direct eye contact with either woman as he returned the volume to its place on the shelves. "The past is irrelevant to current circumstances." "On the contrary," the Duchess countered gently, "it is precisely the past's influence on the present that concerns me now." She turned toward Eleanor, including her in this revelation of long-buried truth. "Your father and I were childhood companions, Eleanor, our estates neighboring one another before the Westmoreland property was acquired by my husband's family. For several years, we believed ourselves destined for marriage, a future encouraged by both our families until my father's unexpected financial reversals rendered me a less advantageous match." Lord Blackwood made a sound of protest, but the Duchess continued with quiet determination. When William's father insisted he look elsewhere for a bride more capable of enhancing the family fortunes, he initially refused, declaring his intention to marry for affection rather than advantage. Eleanor stared at her father in astonishment. This image of youthful romantic idealism impossibly at odds with the pragmatic, emotionally distant man who had raised her with such emphasis on duty and practical considerations above all else. "I had no notion of your father's sacrifice until after my own parents arranged my introduction to Jeremiah Hayes," the Duchess continued, moving to stand directly before Lord Blackwood, forcing him to meet her gaze. "By the time you returned from university prepared to defy your father's wishes, I had already developed genuine affection for my future husband. The wound to your pride was profound, I know, but what you have never acknowledged, William, is that your love for me had already begun to transform into possessive pride long before I chose Jeremiah." Eleanor watched her father's face as the Duchess spoke, witnessing emotions she had never before seen him display, flickers of pain and recognition that suggested these words contained truths he had refused to confront throughout his adult life. "The hatred you carry has always been about me, not our children," the Duchess stated firmly, her voice gentle despite the directness of her words. "Let them be free of our past, William. Alexander and Eleanor deserve the chance we never had, to marry where their hearts lead without the shadow of their parents' grievances poisoning their happiness. The simple plea hung in the air between them, a request that acknowledged the genuine pain of youth while asking for the wisdom of age to finally prevail over decades of cultivated bitterness. Lord Blackwood remained silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the Duchess to Eleanor and finally to the portrait of his long-dead rival, the man who had won Catherine's heart through genuine connection rather than the possessive attachment he had mistaken for love in his own youth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the exhaustion of maintaining animosity across decades. "I constructed an entire life around that rejection," he admitted with evident difficulty. "Every decision, every relationship, even my marriage and approach to fatherhood, all shaped by that singular moment when my pride suffered its greatest wound." Eleanor moved closer to her father, drawn by this unprecedented vulnerability in a man who had always presented himself as invulnerable to emotional weakness. She had prepared herself for continued opposition, even for permanent estrangement should he prove incapable of accepting her choice. But this glimpse of genuine self-awareness awakened hope that reconciliation might indeed be possible, if not immediately, then perhaps with time and patience. The morning of Eleanor's wedding day arrived with a symphony of birdsong and golden light that streamed through the windows of her chamber at Rosemont, where final preparations were underway for the ceremony scheduled to take place at noon in the Westmoreland family chapel. 3 weeks had passed since the revelatory confrontation in the Duchess's study, weeks filled with the necessary arrangements for a wedding that, while modest by aristocratic standards, still required considerable attention to ensure both propriety and meaning. Alexander had insisted on observing all possible formalities, despite the unusual circumstances, obtaining a special license that would allow the ceremony to proceed without the traditional reading of banns, while still maintaining the essential legal requirements for a binding union. The Duchess had overseen the preparations with characteristic efficiency, engaging the local vicar, arranging for appropriate flowers and music, and extending invitations to a small circle of trusted friends and family members who might serve as witnesses to this unconventional but heartfelt union. Eleanor stood before the looking-glass as Jane, who had arrived from Blackwood Manor the previous day bearing good wishes from Lady Blackwood, made final adjustments to her wedding attire, a gown of ivory silk, far simpler than the elaborate creation that had been planned for her match with a local gentleman her father had favoured, yet somehow more suited to her true character and the genuine affection that formed the foundation of this marriage. No word had come from Lord Blackwood since his departure from Rosemont following the revelation of his youthful history with the Duchess, his silence neither confirming acceptance nor declaring continued opposition, leaving Eleanor to prepare for her wedding day with mingled joy at her imminent union with Alexander and lingering sadness at the apparent absence of paternal blessing. "Your mother sent this for you to wear today," Jane said softly, presenting a small velvet box that contained a pair of pearl earrings, Eleanor recognized as family heirlooms worn by Blackwood brides for generations. "She believes your father will come to accept your choice in time, though his pride prevents him from acknowledging it directly at present." The gesture brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, this tangible connection to her family heritage, suggesting that bridges remained possible even across the chasm created by her unprecedented defiance of paternal authority. The ancient stone chapel that had served the Westmoreland family for centuries stood a short distance from the main estate, its weathered exterior softened by climbing roses now in full bloom, its interior transformed for the occasion with arrangements of spring flowers that filled the space with color and fragrance. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes and family heraldry, casting jewel-toned patterns across the worn flagstone floor as Eleanor made her way down the center aisle on the arm of the Duchess's brother, Lord Harrington, who had agreed to give her away in her father's absence. Alexander waited at the altar, his expression transforming with undisguised adoration as he beheld his bride approaching, the simple dignity of the moment more meaningful than any elaborate society wedding might have been. Surrounded as they were by only those who genuinely supported their union, rather than social connections gathered for display or advantage. They stood together before the vicar, Their hands joined as they prepared to exchange the vows that would bind them legally and spiritually, the culmination of a connection that had defied family history and social expectation to flourish against all odds. Just as Eleanor began to speak the words that would make her Alexander's wife, a slight disturbance at the back of the chapel drew her attention, causing her to falter momentarily as she recognized the tall figure who had entered silently and now stood watching the proceedings with an expression she could not quite interpret from this distance. Lord Blackwood had come after all, his presence neither announced nor explained, yet undeniably significant as a witness to this moment of transition in his daughter's life. He made no move to interrupt or approach, simply standing in silent observation as Eleanor gathered herself and turned back to Alexander, completing her vows with renewed conviction, her voice clear and steady in the hushed atmosphere of the ancient chapel. Throughout the remainder of the service, she remained acutely aware of her father's presence, this unexpected gift of acknowledgement, however tentative, adding a dimension of completion to her joy that she had not dared to hope for when planning this day. As the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander claimed his first kiss as her lawful husband, Eleanor turned toward the back of the chapel, seeking confirmation that her father's appearance had not been merely wishful imagination. Lord Blackwood remained where he had entered, his rigid posture perhaps slightly softened, his expression still unreadable at this distance, yet his continued presence speaking volumes about the internal struggle between pride and paternal feeling that had apparently brought him to witness this union he had so vehemently opposed. When the newly married couple proceeded back down the aisle arm in arm, they paused briefly before Lord Blackwood, whose formal bow acknowledged his daughter's new status as Duchess of Westmoreland without requiring him to express explicit approval in words he might not yet be ready to offer. "Father," Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "thank you for coming." The simple statement hung between them, an olive branch extended without demand or expectation, leaving space for whatever level of reconciliation he might be prepared to accept in this moment. Lord Blackwood regarded his daughter, then Alexander, with an expression that suggested internal conflict not yet fully resolved, but perhaps beginning to shift toward acceptance of what could not be changed. "Your mother would not have forgiven my absence," he replied finally, the words ostensibly explaining his presence as duty rather than choice, yet delivered with a hint of the dry humor that Eleanor remembered from her early childhood, before bitterness had overwhelmed his capacity for genuine warmth. It was not effusive blessing nor complete reconciliation, but it represented a beginning, a small crack in the wall of resentment that had separated them, offering hope that time might eventually heal the breach that recent events had created between father and daughter, allowing Eleanor to move forward into her new life with Alexander, while maintaining connection to her family roots. The gardens of Westmoreland Park blazed with color beneath a perfect June sky, roses of every hue unfurling their petals to the warm summer sun as guests strolled along immaculately kept paths, their voices creating a pleasant hum of conversation that mingled with the string quartet playing from a nearby pavilion. 1 year had passed since Eleanor had become the Duchess of Westmoreland, a year of adjustment, discovery, and gradual healing for all concerned, culminating in this garden party that represented far more than mere social obligation. Eleanor moved among her guests with natural grace, her simple gown of pale blue silk accommodating the gentle curve of her abdomen where the heir to Westmoreland grew, a secret shared thus far only with Alexander and the Duchess Dowager, but soon to be announced to the assembled company. She had planned every aspect of this gathering with careful attention to symbolism, from the selection of guests that included both Hayes and Blackwood connections, to the centerpiece of the garden where Blackwood roses, transplanted from her mother's garden, now grew alongside Westmoreland varieties in a living representation of the union their marriage had created. Alexander found her near this symbolic planting, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection that characterized their private interactions, a tenderness that had only deepened during their first year of marriage as they built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love, rather than social expectation or family obligation. "I believe your father has finally arrived," he murmured, nodding toward the garden entrance where Lord and Lady Blackwood were being greeted by the Duchess Dowager, their attendance representing another small step in the gradual reconciliation that had progressed through cautious correspondence and occasional brief visits throughout the past year. Lord Blackwood had maintained a certain formal reserve in his interactions with Eleanor and Alexander, his pride still too deeply ingrained to permit complete acknowledgement of error in his previous opposition to their match. Yet the rigid hostility had gradually given way to a tentative acceptance that grew more genuine with each encounter. Eleanor watched as her parents made their way through the garden, her mother appearing stronger than she had during the difficult period preceding Eleanor's departure from Blackwood Manor, Lady Blackwood's quiet rebellion having apparently sparked a recalibration of their marital dynamic that benefited her health and spirits. She moved to greet them, accepting her mother's warm embrace and her father's more formal bow with equal appreciation for the effort both represented in healing family wounds that had once seemed beyond repair. As guests began moving toward the refreshment pavilion at the signal from servants in Westmoreland livery, Eleanor found a moment of relative privacy with her father, who had lingered behind to examine a particularly fine specimen of climbing rose that combined characteristics of both family varieties. An impressive achievement, he observed with the genuine appreciation of one knowledgeable gardener to another. Your mother tells me you directed this hybridization yourself. Eleanor nodded, pleased by his recognition of her horticultural project that had occupied many peaceful hours during her first months at Westmoreland. Nature often accomplishes what human determination resists, she replied, touching a velvet bloom with gentle fingers. These roses have no interest in ancient family feuds or wounded pride, only in creating something new and beautiful from their combined strengths. Lord Blackwood regarded his daughter with an expression that suggested dawning recognition of the woman she had become, so different from the dutiful, compliant girl he had raised, yet carrying elements of that younger self, transformed and strengthened through her own choices and experiences. I was wrong, Eleanor, he said finally, the simple declaration clearly costing him considerable effort yet offered without qualification or excuse. In my determination to protect you from what I perceived as danger, I nearly denied you the happiness you have clearly found with Hayes. With Alexander, Eleanor corrected gently, offering the personal name as tacit invitation to move beyond formal acknowledgement to genuine family connection. She met her father's gaze directly, neither demanding further apology nor dismissing the significance of this admission. Thank you, Father. Your acceptance means more than you might imagine, particularly now. Lord Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly at her emphasis on the final words, his gaze dropping momentarily to the subtle curve of her figure before returning to her face with dawning comprehension. Eleanor smiled, confirming his unspoken question with a small nod. Alexander and I plan to make the announcement today, she explained. We hoped you and Mother would be here to share in the news. For the first time since her childhood, Eleanor witnessed her father's expression transform with genuine, unguarded emotion, pride and tentative joy breaking through the mask of restraint he had worn for decades. He offered his arm with formal correctness that could not disguise the sentiment behind the gesture. Then perhaps you might permit me to escort you to the pavilion, Your Grace. The simple courtesy, with its acknowledgement of both her new status and their blood connection, symbolized the gradual rebuilding of family bonds that had seemed irreparably broken during their confrontation a year earlier. As they walked together toward the gathering where Alexander waited to announce their joyful news, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment and fulfilled hope. The command she had heard in her father's study that day, "I forbid you to love him," had not destroyed her chance at happiness, but had instead forced her to discover her own strength and courage, to claim the future she desired, rather than accepting the one determined for her by others. The Duke had overheard and asked for her hand, but more importantly, Eleanor had finally heard her own heart's wisdom and found the courage to follow where it led, healing not only her own life, but ultimately beginning to heal the wounds that had separated two families for generations, creating space for love to flourish, where bitterness had once seemed permanently rooted.